Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about ratios. We're going to be introducing the concept of ratios. So before we start with today's class, you're going to need a couple things. You're going to need a notebook, your math notebook. We're going to be entering information on page 50 today. You're going to need some markers or some color pencils or some crayons because we're going to color code some information. And then of course you're going to need your pencil to write your notes down. So again, we're on page 50 of your notebook, and we're going to start by writing our learning target at the top of today's notebook. And that learning target is, I can use data to set up ratios. So if you'll take just a minute, if you need to pause the video to put your learning target at the top. And then of course today is the 22nd. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about ratios. So the title of today's page is Ratios. And if you don't know anything about ratios, then that's the purpose of this lesson. And if you do, then this is going to be a review lesson for you. So a ratio is a comparison of two or more quantities. So this basically means that we are comparing two or more sets of numbers. So if you'll write that down, then we're going to talk about some examples of ratios. I can use ratios when I describe things like the number of boys versus the number of girls in my class. I can use ratios when I describe the number of wins that a ball team has versus the number of losses that a ball team has. I can even use ratios to describe the number of red shirts that I have in my drawer versus the number of blue shirts that I have in my drawer. So all of these are comparisons, meaning you compare two things of two or more quantities. Now, with ratios, we can write them three ways. So there are three ways to write ratios. The first way is in word form. So we can use the word to, T-O. I might say the ratio comparison is 3 to 4, which means I have 3 red shirts and 4 blue shirts in my drawer. So the ratio is 3 compared to 4. That's word form. The second method that I can use to compare these is what's called colon form. And colon, you might know, looks like this. So that looks like, and I, instead of writing a colon, wrote the word to, so we're going to write the colon. So this would be read 3 to 4, not 3:4. When you read it 3 to 4. The final way is in fraction form. And if I use fraction form, I'm going to write it as a fraction, so it looks like this. But it doesn't mean 3 out of 4 necessarily, which is what a typical fraction means. So we have to be very careful that we understand that this is a comparison of one part to another. Now, as we're comparing these things, you're going to learn that there are different types of things that we can compare. So we're going to write these down in our notebook. The first type of comparison that I can make is called a part-to-part comparison. So you will see that I'm using one of my colored pencils or markers, whatever you chose to use. We're using a part-to-part comparison here. So if I said I want you to compare one part to another part, that means we're not comparing one thing to the whole group. We are comparing two parts of the group. So there's your definition. You might hear it called subsets. You're going to do an activity with BuzzMath later, and you're going to see them referred to as subsets. So a really good example of this would be for us to talk about some shapes. So I want you to draw these shapes on your paper. That's a circle. So if you'll take just a second, if you need to pause the video and draw those shapes. Now I can tell you that the number one problem that students have when they are trying to determine ratios is that they don't look carefully at what they are supposed to be comparing. So in this example, I would like you to compare the number of circles to the number of squares. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is how many circles are there? So you go through and you count the number of circles. 1, 2, 3. So that's the first number I'm going to write down. Then I want to compare that to the number of squares that there are. So I go through and I count the number of squares. Well, there's a square, 2, 3, and 4. So the ratio comparison is 3 to 4, or you could write it 3 word form 2, 4, or you could write it in fraction form, which is 3 to 4. So what this means is that I have compared the number of circles to the number of squares, and you notice I counted my number of circles and I counted my number of squares, and then I wrote them in the correct order. Because if I write 4 to 3, that's not the same comparison as 3 to 4. Because this means for every 3 circles, there are 4 squares. That's what that literally means. So I'll give you just a minute if you need to pause the video to finish that particular part. Some really good examples of part-to-part comparisons would be like a comparison of the number of red gumballs to the number of purple gumballs, or the comparison of the number of pennies that you have in your pocket to the number of dimes that you have in your pocket. The number of Hershey's Kisses versus the number of Reese's Pieces, because those are candy. Both of those are types of candy. I'm comparing one part to another part. Boys versus girls would be a part-to-part comparison because we're talking about the students that are in my class. So all of those are part-to-part.